Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf memchet. This is the daf for Shabbat. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Shapiro on the 12th yard side of her brother David Teichman Zichrono Levracha, a lover of Israel and a collector of Israeli stamps, which he saw as a way of marking Israeli history and culture. We're going to get started today with the very top of our daf. We're in Ezu Mukoman, in that chapter of Zevachim, where do all the different sacrifices get slaughtered. So Par v'Sir Shel Yom Kippurim are in the north. So now the Gemara says, Michte tzafon be'olaktiv. Now the tzafon is mentioned specifically in the Korban Ola. So Nine Ola Beresha. Why are we starting, when it starts with, right, it says, these are the ones where the offerings go, and the first one they mention is the Par v'Sir of Yom Kippurim. So why don't they do the Korban Ola first? That would have made much more sense in terms of the order. So they say, Chatat, Aydid Ata Midrasha Chavivale. Because the Chatat is learned out from the Ola from a drasha, it's more, because it says, B'makom asher tishachet Ola, in the place where the Ola was. So we have to it's saying, well, go learn now where the Ola is. So the rabbis always preferred something that's learned out rather than something directly stated. But why did we start with the chata'ot pnimiyot, the ones done in the inner altar? Why did we start with the more basic case of the chata'ot chitzoni? To which they answer, again, the Par Yom Kippurim and the Seir, their blood gets brought into the Kodesh Kodeshim. So they're a beloved offering because it's unique. No other sacrifices like that. And therefore it comes first. So the first two questions are really about the order, why this is in the Mishna first, why specifically specifically sin offering and not burnt offering, and why within the sin offering the ones given on Yom Kippur, the ones brought on Yom Kippur. So now the Gemara says, "V'tzafona ba'ola hechaktiva." So now we want to know, how do we know that tzafon is brought in the Korban Ola? So we're going to start with that and then move from there to the sin offerings. V'shachat oto al yerach hamizbeach tzafona. So it says very clearly in Vayikra Chapter 1, which is all about the Korban Ola, the burnt offering, in verse 11, it says, when it talks about if you're going to bring it from the sheep, then it says, and you should slaughter it in, right, al yerach hamizbeach tzafona, opposite the altar on the northern side, right, which we have all the different opinions of where exactly that is. Eshkacham ben bakar manali, but the bakar, if you bring it from the cattle, not from the sheep, so that's mentioned in the previous verses, and it doesn't say anything there about the north. So how do we get that? Amar kra ve'im minatzon vav mosif al inyam rishon. Because when it introduces, if you bring it from a sheep, it says, and if you bring it from a sheep. So the first section is if you bring it from the cattle. Then it says, and if you bring it from the sheep. Which means that the vav is a connector word. So what's true for the bottom section is going to be true for the earlier section as well. And that's how we get that the earlier section also, an ola, burnt offering brought from cattle, also has to be from slaughtered in the north. And then it says, right, I didn't read the whole line, but vav mosif al yam rishon, vav adds to the previous section, v'yalamed el yomi tachton, and then we learn to the upper part from the lower part, meaning the earlier part we're going to learn from the later part, which is the tzon. So now the Gemara says this statement, which is going to open up a whole door to another sugya, which is hani chalamanda amar lemedin. This only works if you hold that a vav is a connector word that teaches you from one section to another. But if you don't hold that, then what are you going to say? And that's the big question of the Gemara. Now, how do we know? The Gemara seems to assume that there's this machloket about people who learn, right, and use this vav and learn the upper part from the lower part, and some people who don't. Well, now we're going to bring a braita where they're going to show there's a machloket about it. But it's not going to be so clear because at the end, we're going to say that's really not the machloket. And they really don't argue. And that's really going to be the response to the question, or so it seems. The Gemara never really gets back to this original question. But this question presumes that there's a machloket between people who think you can look at a vav as a connector and we can learn from one to the other, and people who don't. In the end, this source is going to try to show that that's this machloket between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. In the end, they're going to say, no, they actually all agree that you can learn El Yomi Tachton or Tachton El Yon, right? It sort of doesn't matter which direction you go in. I mean, it does matter. We're going to see. But the concept is they both really think that the Vav is a connector and allows you, right? Remember, Vav means end, and allows you to learn one from the other. So now we're going to see this bright. Ditanya. V'im nefesh. You really have to know the whole pasuk and what they're talking about. So this is in Vayikra Hey, verses 17 and 18. It's called an asham taloi. We've learned about this before. It's an asham that you bring when you're not sure if you did a sin that you would have had to bring a chatat for if you did it unwittingly, but you're not even sure if you sinned or not. So it's called the asham taloi. And it's introduced with the words ve'im nefesh. And then it says you're supposed to bring this korban asham, a guilt offering. Okay? And nefesh ki tachta v'asta chat mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo te'asena. Okay, you did one of these mitzvot, but lo yada, but you didn't know. V'asham v'nasav no, ve'vi al tamim. Okay, this is what you're supposed to bring. Okay, al shigato asher shagag, and the mistake that you made, right? It will atone for you for this mistake you made, v'hu lo yada v'nislach lo, and you won't know, and you'll be forgiven. Now, it's actually not completely true that you're forgiven. It basically provides you with temporary atonement. In the end, when you figure out that you really made a mistake, if you figured out that you really did, you have to then bring the sin offering. But this tides you over until such point, and you get atonement temporarily. So now the question is, on what do you bring? Now, in general, we say you bring it on things that if you had done it unintentionally, let's put it this way. If you had done it intentionally, you would have gotten karet. And if you did it unintentionally, you bring a sin offering. That's in general when we bring a sin offering, when it's a sin that you would have gotten karet for it if you did it intentionally. And now you did it unwittingly. So now you have a suffix, did I do it or did I not do it? But the question is, why does it start ve'im nefesh? It's really starting a new section. And the section right before is the laws of me'ilah. What is me'ilah? Me'ilah is misuse of consecrated property. What sacrifice did you bring for me'ilah? In asham. So now the question is, what if you have a suffix me'ilah? You're not sure if you accidentally misused consecrated property or not. You just don't know. Okay, you took some stuff, you didn't know what it was, and now you don't even know though. Besides, you didn't realize at the time it was sanctified. Now someone says, I think that might have been sanctified money. I'm not sure. I had two piles. I don't know which is which. Right? This might be sanctified. So now the question is, do you have to bring an asham taloi? Now generally we say it's only for things you'd have to bring a sin offering. This is an asham, a guilt offering. So why would we think that? Well, now we're going to see. So ve'im nefesh lechayev al safek meilot asham taloi divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says this ve'im nefesh comes to, now again, if you view this as a connector word, what are you going to say? The vav connects it to asham meilot, which teaches you that even though generally it's only for sin offerings that you bring an asham taloi, this hanging guilt offering, but since it's right next to me'ilah and there's a vav that connects, we're going to learn from the bottom to the top, meaning from the later case, we're going to learn, asham taloi, you have to bring it, you're not sure, also for the earlier, for the me'ilah case. Right? Again, if you're not sure if you misuse consecrated property, consecrated items. Chachamim potrim. Chachamim say, no, there's no asham taloi for this. And in fact, that's how we rule. So, ma'ala baka mipalge, is this not the machloket? Mar savar l'medina, mar savar ein l'medina. And that proves our point. One holds, we learn, the vav connects. The other holds, we don't learn one from the other. But now we're going to have three more possibilities about what this machloket's all about. Okay? And here goes. Amar of Papa. Now, according to all these explanations, we're actually going to say they all think you can learn El Yom Tachton, or maybe Tachton El Yom, we'll see. But you can learn from one to the other. And therefore, it seems to really respond to the original question, which is, well, then you don't need to ask the question. Because, again, what was our question? It says, right, the ben bakar is learned from the ben son because it has a vav, and that's how we know for an ola that you have to slaughter also if you bring it from the cattle in the north. And it seems like everybody does hold that, so we don't really have a question anymore. We tried to say that's only if you use vav as a connector. If you don't, what are you going to do? Well, not everybody views vav as a connector, and that's right. I'm sorry. In the end, everyone views vav as a connector, so we don't really have the question. So comes Rav Papa and he says, well, if that's not the machloket, what is it? Hainu tama de Rabbanan ne'amal ka mitzvot v'ne'amar b'chatat chelev mitzvot. Okay, the language might have sounded familiar to you, especially if you learn horayot. Right? It started off in the Asham Taloi. If you do mikol mitzvot Hashem asher lo te'asena v'lo yadav Hashem, it's very similar language. The kol mitzvot, that's where the sin offering comes in. If you did one of the mitzvot and you didn't realize it was a sin, etc. So mitzvot is said there. Mitzvot is said here. Right? Chatat chelev is the classic case. If you ate chelev, which is the fats you're not allowed to eat, and that if you did it intentionally, you get karet. Unintentionally, you do a chatat. Mal halan davar shachayavim az dono karet va'al shigato chatat. Avkan shechayavim al dono karev al shigato chatat. That comes to define when do we bring an asham talui. Only if it's like the chatat, not if you would have been obligated in asham. So that excludes asham me'ilot. Even though they do usually use the vav as a connector, this overrides it. For Rabbi Akiva, what are they going to say? Mala halam. So Rabbi Akiva, what are you going to do with that Gzera Shava? So he has the Gzera Shava, mitzvot, but he doesn't learn from it that it's limiting it to only things that you would get right, that zadon karet shagah chatat. But mala halam b'kfuah, av kam b'kfuah lafuke chatat the tumat mikdash v'kodashav de'olev yoredu. It's coming to say, you only bring an asham taloi on something that has a set amount of a set korban that you're supposed to bring, not like the sliding scale chatat offering, where if you're poor, you get to bring something else. If you're even more poor, you get to bring, right, either birds or meal offerings. That you're not going to have an asham taloi for. That's what we learn from the word mitzvot. But it has to be a set korban. It has to be an animal. Well, then asham ilo could actually still be in, and that's why the rabbis, and that's why Rabbi Akiva has it that asham ilo, on a suffix asham ilo, you're going to bring this sin offering. The asham taloi offering, the hanging offering. B'Rabbanan. So now, why don't the rabbis accept what Rabbi Akiva said, which is, accept the Gzera Shava, but the Gzera Shava is only for the issue of kfu'ah, set. So Rabbanan say, Ein Gzera Shava l'mektzah. You can't make a partial Gzera Shava and say, we're only going to learn some things, not other things. No, if you're learning from chatat, you're going to learn everything. It has to be a chatat, right, where there was, again, karet and chatat, and it has to be kfu'ah. But you can't learn only kfu'ah and not limit it to, say, we're not limiting it. We can include asham me'ilot. So you can't do that. So Rabbi Akiva nami in Gzera Shava l'mechtzah. Wait, but now we're going to reject completely what Rav Papa said, because Rav Papa said that it's all about, right, do we go with this Gzera Shava complete or Gzera Shava l'mechtzah? And that's really in the end what they're arguing about. That again, let's just go through. According to Rav Papa, Rabbi Akiva says we can learn it from asham me'ilot because we only have a partial Gzera Shava, and otherwise, we have Yilmad al Yomi Tachton. And whereas Rav Papa says you can learn al Yomi Tachton, but he has the Gzera Shava, which seems to say it really limits it, though. In this case, we're not going to learn al Yomi Tachton here because it's limited based on the Gzera Shava to only if b'mezid chatat shogeg, b'mezid karet shogeg chatat. So the problem, though, is how could Rabbi Akiva only learn this Gzera Shava l'mechtzah? There's no such thing. So we actually reject Rav Papa. Inachinami. He really would, right? In other words, how are you going to do that? So he really would say, Ein Gzera Shava l'mechtzah. So hacha b'hakam yiflageh must be third option if this is the machloket. Rabbi Akiva saval ve'im nefesh k'tiv vav mosif l'nyam rishon. Okay, that's going to be pretty simple every time. We're just going to say, that's why Rabbi Akiva holds what he holds. He says the vav adds. B'Rabbanan nami hakti v'im nefesh. What are they going to say? V'im nefesh. How are they going to resolve it? If they do hold, which we already said, you can learn el yomi tachton. Well, lema b'hakam palge. Let's say this is the machloket. Let's suggest to mar savar hekesh adif umar savar gzera shava adif. In other words, both hold by the gzera shava. It's a complete gzera shava, and both hold by the hekesh. Now, notice that they're changing the wording from the medim el yomi tachton to a hekesh. Hekesh is two things that are juxtaposed. This is a little more than a hekesh because the vav connects them to say they're even more juxtaposed because of the vav. So we have two things pulling in two different directions. Limidim el yomi tachton, which they both agree with, pulls you to say you would bring asham taloi for a suffix whether you did me'ila or not. On the other hand, we have the Gzera Shava pulling saying it's only things that are b'mezid. If you did them intentionally, you get karet. Unintentionally, you bring a sin offering. So now we're a little bit stuck. Which one is right? Which one do we do? Well, that's the machloket. Which one is stronger? One says Gzera Shava adif and one says Hekesh adif. So Rabbi Akiva says the Hekesh is more strong. The fact that they're next to each other in the psukim and there's a vav in between them. And the rabbis say no, the Gzera Shava is much stronger. Okay, that's the machloket. To which the Gemara rejects this as well. And now we're going to be on to our last answer. Look, the Kule Alma, the Hekesh Adif. Really, they both think Limidim al Yomi Tachton would be stronger. Ve'amre l'charabanan, amre l'charabanan, tachton hu degamar me'elyon, la'asham bekesef shkalim. It's not that we're going to learn the upper section from the lower section to the upper. We're not going to learn from the later section here. The vav is a connector. The question is, in which direction does the connection go? So Rabbi Akiva, till now we've been saying that the later section is proving about the earlier section. The later section is going to be relevant also in the previous section, also for Me'ilah. So you're going to bring an Asham Taloi if you're not sure if you did Me'ilah or not. But the rabbis say it's the opposite direction. We're going to learn something from Asham Me'ilah, which it says there that it doesn't say by the Asham Taloi. And again, they're both Asham, but there it says you have to bring it, it's worth 2 shkalim. There's a minimum value for what this animal, right? We've had before, you could bring a lower level, right? Cheaper one. We talked about the meal offering or the bird. But within animals, we don't usually differentiate between how much you have to spend on your animal. But for an Asham, you have to spend a certain minimum amount of money. So now they're going to say the following. We're going to learn, right, from the Asham that you have to bring for Be'ilo, which is Shnei Shkalim, which in the time of the Gemara was actually worth 2 Slaim, which is 8 dinarim altogether, which is for 8 Zuzim. Dinarim and Zuzim are the same. So we're going to learn that Shalot Tomar. Now you might have thought, maybe an Asham Taloi doesn't need to be that minimum amount. Why not? Well, in other words, let's say you just assume. It says that by one Asham, we can say all guilt offerings need to be that minimum amount. But you could have come up with a logical explanation here. Again, what's an Asham Taloi? It's maybe I did something wrong that I have to bring a sin offering for. Now, a sin offering doesn't have a minimum amount. So what? Now here, let's read it in the words. Shalot Tomar, that you won't say, we need this drasha, because otherwise you might have said, Lo yehi sveiko chamor mivada'o. You can't possibly, if I'm not sure if I did it or not, and I'm bringing this korban in the interim, what, it's going to cost more than the actual korban would have cost? Right? Because ma vadai chatat badanka, for a definite chatat, it could be like a 1/6 of a dinar if you want. It doesn't have any required amount. As sveiko asham bardanka. Also, your safek asham, you would think, maybe should be a danka. It should be no more than that. Maybe you can't even bring it for more than that, because that would be an absurd thing. Well, that's why you need a drasha to say no. It's a guilt offering. A guilt offering has its rules, and it has to be 2 shkalim, and that's what the vav is for. So again, it's to learn from Me'ilo to Asham Taloi. Rabbi Akiva, Hai Svara Manale. So where does Rabbi Akiva get the kesef shkalim? And that's, by the way, going to be our answer. That's the machlokah between them. Now, if Rabbi Akiva learns El Yomi Tachton, he learns it to say that Asham Taloi is also brought in a case of Safek Me'ilah. Well, how is he going to learn this halakha about the kesef shkalim? So he's going to learn from somewhere else. Nafkalemi zot Torah Asham. Torah achat lekol Ashamot. Because it says these are the rules for Asham, they learn from there that all the rules of the Asham are true for all the different korbanot Asham. Okay, but that, like we saw before, this structure which says, well, that only works if you hold, okay, so Tinach mandi le Torah. Some people darshan Torah means it's true for all the cases, but not everybody does. Mandi le Torah, if you don't hold that that's what Torah is there for, mehecha gamar. So where are you going to learn to all the other korbanot Hashem, and particularly also to our case? So the answer, be'erkecha, be'erkecha. Okay, be'erkecha appears, right? Ve'vi al tamim minatzon. This is by our pasuk in Asham Taloi. Be'erkecha, within its value, la'asham ala kohen. Okay, so bring minatzon in its value as a guilt offering to the kohen. And in the Me'ilah pasuk it says, "Ve'vi et hashamo la'Hashem el tamo tamim el tamim minatzon, or ayel tamim minatzon, it should be be'erkecha kesef shkalim b'shekel hakodesh." Okay, in its value, it has to be kesef shkalim, 2 shkalim. So there you have the same word be'erkecha. You can learn the gzera shava from one to the other. Now, okay, so that teaches you from Asham Me'ilo to the Asham Taloi, where it says the word be'erkecha. But what about other cases of a korban asham? Like, for example, asham shifcha charufa, to lokti be'erkecha, there it doesn't say value in its value. So, how are you going to learn that for the shifcha charufa case, which I'm not going to get into right now what it is, we've talked about it before, we'll see it other times. But, so if you have to bring an asham shifcha charufa, where are you going to learn that from? Gamar be'el. Okay, we learn it from the word El. You're supposed to bring an ayel, a ram there, and it says ram there, because it's the same animal, we're going to learn it also has to have the same value. Again, another Gzera Shava. Okay, this was a very long-winded arguing, a whole back and forth. This was all to teach you where do we know by the Ola, by the Ben Bakar, that also you need to be on the north, and that we learn from the Vav that connects it to the Ben Atzon. If you bring it from the sheep, it said it has to be north. Therefore, the section before, which is connected with a Vav, we learn from the lower section to the upper section. Then we said, right, that only works if you hold we can learn. If you don't hold we can learn, then what are you going to say? And then in the end, right, when we tried to prove from the whole Asha Me'ilo case that you can't learn from what, that some people think you can't learn, in fact, the rabbi's position. But in the end, we said, no, the rabbi's position is you can learn, okay? It's just that they have other reason for saying, and in the end, it's you can learn, you just learn something else in the other direction and not the direction that Rabbi Akiva was going in. And that's the root of their debate, even though we did try two other suggestions in the middle, which didn't succeed. Right, which is either maybe the Hekesh is Adif or the Gzera Shava is Adif, or do you have a Gzera Shava, do you only use the Gzera Shava for something else, which in the end each of these we rejected and came up with other explanation. Okay, now we're going to go back to our topic. So we have the Ola. Where do we get the Ola from? Now where do we get that the Chatat has to be in the north? This is all about things have to be slaughtered in the north. Chatat Manalan Debayat Safon. So how do you know that a Chatat, a sin offering, needs the north? Okay, this is very simple. It says in the, this is in the basic sin offering that the individual brings. It says, slaughter it in the place where the Ola is. Okay, so that teaches us slaughtering. Kabbalah minal, and how do you know the blood has to be accepted in the north? Well, dichtiv, it says right after that, v'lakach hakohen. This is actually not this pasuk. This is in, there's two psukim for chatat, or two descriptions at the end of chapter 4 of Vayikra, which describe if you bring the chatat offering from a seirat izim, a female goat, or if you bring the sin offering from a female, from a kispa, right, from a female sheep. So it describes both those things, and in the second section it says it as well. We'll get back to that later, that you have to bring it in like the Ola. Do in the same place you brought the Ola, and it immediately says, V'lakach hakohen midama be'etzbo, and the Kohen takes the blood, which sounds like he takes it right away, he's in the same place. So the taking of the blood has to happen in the same place. Now that shows you that the blood has to be accepted, but mekabel atzmo minalan. How do we know that the one who's accepting the blood has to also be standing there and can't just, somehow extend his hand far out but not actually be in the north side? Amar kra v'lakach, because it says v'lakach hakohen, he takes it, lo yikach. They darshan this word, himself he has to bring, not just take it himself, but take himself to that spot. He has to be standing right there. Okay, so we have a pasuk for v'shachat, the shchit has to be in the north. Then we get the Kabbalah has to be in the north, and not only the blood, but the acceptance of the blood, but the person accepting the blood. But this was all written once, so eshkachan lemitzvah, this might be the ideal. But la'akev minal, and how do you know though that it's essential, and if you don't do it, it's not going to be accepted? Krachri naktiv, because there's another pasuk that says it, and this is by the chatat of the nasi, of the prince, so to speak, which we understood to be the king. That's what came up in Horayot. Here it says again, you slaughter it in the place where you did the Ola, also in the north. Vitanya, and the Braita says like this: Hechan Ola nishchata b'tzafon. Right, where's the Ola? In the north. That's where it's slaughtered. Avseh b'tzafon. So from there you get this also in the north. Then they say v'chi mikan atalamed. Wait, you're going to learn from here. Halo kvar ne'amal b'mkom asher tishachet Ola tishachet hachatat. But it already says, okay, now we're quoting a different pasuk. This is a pasuk where it starts out, V'zot Torat HaChatat, and these are the rules for a sin offering. It's in Vayikra chapter 6. It says in verse 18, speak to Bnei Israel and say, speak to Aharon and his sons and tell him, Zot Torat HaChatat, these are the rules for a sin offering. B'makom asher tishachet ha'olah tishachet ha'chatat. In the place where you do the Olah, you should do the sin offering also, meaning in the north. Here's a third pasuk. If you notice, we actually have 4 pasukim, but we only saw 3 inside so far. 1 by the Se'irizim, if you bring the Seirat Izim, the female goat, for your sin offering. 2 by the Nasi, and 3 by this other general pasuk about sin offerings. Now, what the Braita is saying, they're going to show how we learn from the Nasi pasuk. They're ignoring the earlier pasuk about the individual sin offering, but from the Nasi pasuk, which is actually earlier. Earlier I meant the first one we mentioned, the Nasi pasuk, which is also in chapter 4, but earlier in the chapter, and this pasuk in Vayikra Vav. From the two we're going to learn. Now we're going to see halama yatsa. So if already we had a general pasuk, slaughter in the place where you do the ola, which is the north. So why did they specify specifically by the nasi? So the answer is likba lo makom, to say this is its place. If you don't slaughter it there, it's disqualified. Okay, so that we got those two psukim teach you it's essential. Now, now this is still the same Braita. The Braita can even say, wait a minute, maybe not. You're saying it comes for this reason. Maybe it's to say maybe by the Nasi. Now I'm going to read you the pasuk by the Nasi. It says, you do smicha, v'shachat oto, you slaughter it in the place where you did the olah. Now, it sounds like it and nothing else. We've seen this many times. So maybe you would think it's to tell you that maybe this is the only sin offering. Yes, it's true, it says zot Torah chatat, but maybe this is the only one really, or the only one that is essential. Talmud Lamal, v'shachat tachata bimkom ha'olah. That's why we need the third pasuk, which is the one by the individual sin offering on Vayikra, chapter 4, verse 29. So you can't say v'shachat oto is limiting it just to the Nasi sin offering, because we have a different pasuk which seems to say this is general for all the sin offerings. Okay, so now eshkachan seir nasi bein lemitzvah bein lakev. Now, if you're going to learn that it's essential from the seir of the Nasi together with the pasuk in chapter 6, which was that zot Torah chatat, these are the general rules for chatat, you have to do it. So then we get that the chatat nasi is ma'akev because we have two psukim that cover that topic, right? Because that general pasuk obviously covers the nasi as well. Sha'ar chataot nami eshkachan lemitzvah la'akev minalam. But right now, I say right now because that's all we mentioned in the Gemara right now, is verse 29 in chapter 4, which is the general sin offering, and there it says do it in the place where you do the olah. So we only have one there. How do we know it's ma'akev? Dichtiv bikis. We have two psukim. As I said, one says it if you're bringing the female sheep, and one says it if you're bringing the female goat. That's already two psukim, in addition to the two about, right, the Nasi, and the one that we use for the Nasi to say it's essential. Then we have these other two psukim, and that makes it essential there, and therefore we learn that all the chataot have to be done in the north, and if they're not, it's disqualified. Okay, but now we have a side question that we kind of brought up the suggestion that the word oto, you slaughter it, is excluding. Maybe only this sin offering needs north and nothing else. But we said you can't say that because it already said the general, right? We saw it in other places in the individual sin offering that needs to be in the north. So, ela oto lamali. So what do we do with that word oto? This and nothing else. What does that mean? Well, we need it for the following Braita. Oto b'tzavon ve'ein seir nachshon b'tzavon. So the first suggestion is that this is coming to say this has to be done in the north, but there is, and all the other sin offerings, other than one sin offering. Which one is that? This is the sin offerings that were brought. There were goat offerings brought from the Nisi'im, the heads of each of the tribes. Okay, we were talking about the Nasi, which we said is the king. But in those days, there were the Nisi'im, Parshat Naso, which is all the Nisi'im brought sacrifices when they sanctified the ceremony, basically, to consecrate the tabernacle. And they all brought gifts. And one of the things they brought was this Seir Yisim Echad Chatat. So that Seir, that's what they call it, Nachshon, because he was one of the Nisi'im. That doesn't have to be in the tzafon. Now, why? This is interesting. The thought here that maybe it doesn't need tzafon is because it's not a typical sin offering. They didn't actually do a sin. So it's not a sin offering, so it doesn't have the same rules. And why would you have thought that? V'tanya, v'samach yado al rosh hasir. So now it says, okay, this is a pasuk in Vayikra Daled, chapter 24 about the Nasi. It says he puts his yad on the head of the seir. Now it doesn't need to say seir. Could have just said al rosho. We know it's a seir because that's what the Nasi is bringing. So they say, why does it say v'samach yado al rosh hasir? L'rabot se'ir nachshon l'smicha. It's to teach you that se'ir nachshon also required smicha, even though it didn't tell you that in the psukim there. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now what we're going to say is like this. Since Rabbi Yehuda thought it needed smicha, and had that drasha, well, then you might have thought that it also needs to be in safon, and that's what Oto comes to say, Oto, but not se'ir nachshon. Now, Rabbi Shimon disagrees. He says, L'rabot sirei avodah zarah l'smicha. It's actually not teaching you anything about se'ir nachshon. It's teaching you about the se'ir avodah zarah. That's the se'ir that the majority of the community follows the mistaken erroneous ruling of the court and starts, right, worshiping idols, thinking that it's okay somehow, whatever they thought wasn't idol worship maybe, and they do it. They also have to do smicha there. It also doesn't say that in the pasuk. And that's what the se'ir is coming to include. That se'ir, not the se'ir of nachshon. So now, going back to the Rabbi Yehuda, Sakadatach, and this is what I said before, Sakadatach Amina, you would have thought, Ho'il v'drabu l'smicha drabu namu l'safon, since they included for smicha, maybe also would need the north, Kamash Malan, that's why you need it. So that works fine, except that Ravina is going to add a difficulty and say, wait a minute, Matkiv la Ravina, Hanicha Rabbi Yehuda, well, you explain according to Rabbi Yehuda why you need Oto, because you might have thought, just like smicha is needed for se'ir nachshon, we could learn also north, and it's not. But the Rabbi Shimon Ma'ika Lamemer, he doesn't learn anything there to se'ir nachshon. So there'd be no reason to think that, right? There'd be no reason to need a drasha to say, since, right, we wouldn't even have thought to learn to se'ir nachshon, because the only reason to have thought to learn to se'ir nachshon was this issue of the smicha and smicha samacha rosh se'ir. If you say that se'ir is not a reference to your se'ir nachshon, then why would you have even thought to learn anything? And then you wouldn't need Oto to say this isn't true for se'ir nachshon. You don't need north. So, Amar Lemer Zutra Berei Rav Tavi LeRavina, he actually says, well, the Rabbi Yehuda minicha, it doesn't even work according to Rabbi Yehuda. Forget that the question's according to Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't really work according to Rabbi Yehuda, because the Maidi et Rabbi, Maidi lo et Rabbi. He would have said, there's a special pasuk to teach smicha, that smicha applies to se'ir nachshon. But you wouldn't have necessarily said, you would have said, okay, there's a special drasha that says this applies to se'ir nachshon. But you wouldn't have thought that anything else would apply to se'ir nachshon. So you wouldn't need a pasuk to limit and say, oh, slaughtering in the north doesn't apply to se'ir nachshon. There'd be no reason to have thought that. You might have thought, look, without the Oto, only this and not se'ir nachshon, maybe you would have said, we can learn it from a binyanav, right? Classic, okay, chatat, whatever's true for this is true for that. But then we go back to what we just learned. Then you don't need a drasha to teach you about smicha. You would have said smicha also comes from a binyanav. Smicha is by this chatat, it must be by that chatat as well. Ella, this whole nachshon thing is irrelevant because midorot lo gamrinan. We don't learn from a chatat that's forever to a chatat that was a one-time thing. That nachshon thing was a one-time thing. Hachanami midorot lo gamrinan. So just like by smicha, we don't learn lidorot. Also, by the needing it to be in the north, we don't learn from one to the other. So, Oto doesn't work for anybody, really. Okay? So, that's not the Oto drasha, the limit to se'ir nachshon is an irrelevant drasha. We don't need it. We wouldn't have ever thought to learn from one to the other. So now they say, okay, so now we're left with our question. What is Oto coming for? So this is going to be the second answer. Ella Oto bat safon, ve'en shocheh bat safon. What is shachat Oto? Oto is the animal. But you don't have to be in the north. We learned this already. Remember, you could stick your hand in, you could stick the knife in, right, and extend it far out, and you don't really have to be in the north. So then they say, wait, I don't need the Oto drasha for that. Shochet mid Rabbi Achia nafka. Rabbi Achia learns it from a different place. We could learn it from there. We don't need this drasha. Detanya. Rabbi Achia omer. V'shachat Oto al yerach hamizbeach tzafona. Now, this is the same one, the same pasuk. Actually, it's not the same pasuk. Sorry. This is the pasuk actually by the Ola. That's the issue, right? This is the pasuk by the Ola. In other words, we don't need it from the Chata pasuk because we learned it already from the Ola pasuk. How so? Mata mulomal. Why does it say v'shachat oto al yerach hamizbeach tzafona? Okay, this is in Vayikra Yud Aleph Yud Aleph. This is where we started with the Ben Baka, with the Ben. Sorry, Imanatzon. Excuse me. So now. He says v'shachat oto al yerach hamizbeach tzafona. Mata mulomal. Why do we have this? The fish matzinu omeh b'tzafon umekabel b'tzafon v'mama b'darom v'kibel b'tzafon pasul yachol af zekin. Now, what they really darshnik here is the word oto in that pasuk. Okay, now it says, if you stand in the tzafon and accept it in the tzafon, right? That's what we've a figure, right? You have to stand there and accept it, accept the blood. Now, if you stood, we saw this before. This is an earlier drasha. How do we know? V'lakach lo, right? You have to bring yourself also. So if you were in the darom and you accepted in the tzafon, it doesn't work because the mekabel adam has to be in the north. So you might have thought with shchita it's the same thing. That's why you need the pasuk. Talmud lomar oto. V'shachat oto is the animal. Oto b'tzafon ve'ena shochet b'tzafon. So only the animal, but not the slaughterer. Ela oto b'tzafon ve'en bein of b'tzafon. So now, okay, so just to be clear, what did we just do here? We wanted to learn from oto in the chata pasuk. What's it coming there for? In the nasi. And we said, right, the first option was maybe it's say not sir nachshon. We just said in the end, there's no reason to have ever thought it would apply to sir nachshon. So you don't need a drasha to say no, it doesn't. The second was oto b'tzafon, but not the shochet in the tzafon. But we said that we learned for the ola pasuk. We don't need this to teach it either. So the third is ela oto b'tzafon ve'em bein of b'tzafon. The chatat has to be in the tzafon, but not the chatat of. Only the chatat of an animal, not the sin offering of a bird. How do we know this? Titania. Okay, now they're going to see. You're going to see that you learn it from here. Yachol yehe ben of. We're bringing a brighter to basically prove this is the drasha. Yachol yehe ben of talun safon. You might have thought the bird needs to be done in the north. Vidinu, and it's logical. Why? Uma ben son shelo kavalo kohen. Kavalo tzafon. Now, here's an interesting difference between an animal and a bird. Generally, you would think the animal offerings are more stringent, but actually, in one issue, the bird offerings are more stringent, which is, we learned already that shechita could be done by anybody, not necessarily even a kohen, right? It doesn't even have to be a male, it could be a woman. But what do we know there? So anyone can do shechita, but not for the bird. The bird, we do malika. It's a unique method that only the kohanim did. Nobody else did them, and you're not allowed to do it. We're disqualified. So ma ben son shelo kavalo kohen. You don't have to have a kohen doing it, and yet kavalo tzafon, and yet it has to be in the north. So simple kavachomer. Ben of shekavalo kohen, ben of, right? If you want to slaughter a bird, that the kohen has to do it. It can't be anybody else. Enud inchi kavalo tzafon. Wouldn't you think it needs north? Talmud lamal. That's why we need this drasha. Oto. Okay, there we have it. But then they say, wait, what kind of kavachomer is this? Mala ben son sheken kavalo kli. But a ben son has a kli. What does that mean? It has a knife. How do you do the slaughtering for the bird? It's not shechita, it's malika. Kohen does it with his finger. You don't even need a vessel. You don't even need a utensil. So Ella, so that doesn't work. Okay? Because in the end, that kavachomer is not a good kavachomer reasoning. So again, kavachomer would lead you to say maybe you would think the oaf needs safon, and the oto comes to say, no, it doesn't. But if you don't have the kavachomer, then you have no reason to think that the bird would need to be done in the north. Fourth answer, ela oto b'tzafon ve'em pesach b'tzafon. Okay, you do this animal, the chatat, the sin offering, but not the korban pesach. That doesn't need safon. So now we're going to have another reason why you would think that. You have to have a kavachomer again. Titania, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, yachol yehe pesach ta'un safon. You might have thought that maybe pesach needs safon. Vidinu, and here's the logical argument. Ma ola shelo kavalo zman l'shchitato kavalo tzafon, in an ola, in a burnt offering, it doesn't have any particular time you have to bring it. It's not set on a particular date. And yet, you have to do it in a particular place, right? No specified time, but yes, specified place. Pesach, shekavalo zman l'shchitato, Pesach is a very specific time. Only on the 14th in the afternoon can you do it. Ein odin shekavalo tzafon, so don't you think if it has a specified time, it would also have a specified place of the north? Talmud lomar oto, and that's why you need oto to say, oh no, it's not like you might have thought. To which the Gemara is going to start a slew of questions on this kavachomer. How could you possibly say that ola is less stringent than pesach? The pesach is more stringent. Malo ola shekin kalil. Ola gets completely burned. That makes it more stringent, and that's why it needs safon and pesach doesn't. You don't need any drasha to say it doesn't. To which they say, no mechatat. Learn from the sin offering. But because chatat is not burnt entirely, and neither is the pesach, then you can make the kavachomer. But no, malachatat came a chaper chayve kritot. But chatat is very severe because it atones for very severe issues that you're chayv karet for. Again, this is the same idea as we saw this earlier in the Masechet, these comparisons. Me'asham, maybe you learn it from the Asham. No, Ma'al Asham shkein kodshei kodshim. Okay, the Asham is kodshei kodshim, and the Pesach is only kodshim kalim. So you can't make a kal v'chomer. Pesach is more severe. Well, mikulam not, right? Because Asham is also done in the north because it's compared to the Chatat, and the Chatat is done in the place where the Ola is done, and from there we get they're all in the north. Well, mikula nami shkein kodshei kodshim. You can actually say this about all the other ones, even though we had other reasons, but they're all kodshei kodshim. So they're all more serious level of sanctity than the Pesach, so there is no kal v'chomer. Oh, if you do it for those, obviously you'll have to do them for Pesach in the tzafon. That is knocked out completely. So that was after number 4. We're going to go to number 5, but number 5 is really all the way back to number 2. Okay? Elalo lam kedamrina mikara oto b'tzafon ve'ein shochei b'tzafon. It's the person and not, it's the animal and not the person slaughtering. Okay, now before we said you could learn that from the Ola. So now they're going to say, right? We said we learn it from him. He learns it from a different pasuk. Lav l'mi'ute shochei b'tzafon. That's actually not used to say the shochei can't be, it has to be in the tzafon. Ela ein shochei b'tzafon aval mekabel b'tzafon. So now we're going to say that's not, right? That's coming to say it's not just that the shochet ein shochei b'tzafon, but mekabel b'tzafon. In other words, if you had that, you would have thought maybe the mekabel could be in the tzafon. So that would teach you the shochet. I'm sorry, I didn't say this right. Let me say it better. Ela ein shochei b'tzafon. What would that teach you? The shochet's not in the north, but it doesn't have to be in the north, but the mekabel does. So then, in other words, we need one to teach you the shochet doesn't have to be there, but the other one to teach you the shochet doesn't, but the mekabel does. Okay, it's to stress that this one doesn't, oto, but someone else does need to be there. Okay, so oto, this animal, and the animal, not the slaughterer, but when it comes to kabbalat adam, the mekabel adam has to be there. So now they say, wait a minute, mekabel, we already learned that. Mi lakach, remember? Lakach, lo lakach, he takes himself. Mi lakach, it should be lo kach, right? Himself take, nafka. So they say, lakach, lo mashmale. The person who darshan this didn't darshan that, okay? So that's why we need 2 drashot. One to teach, shochet doesn't need to be in the stafon, only the animal, and the other is to say, shochet doesn't, but mekabel does. Okay, that's our drasha. Now we're going to end with this last part, eshchan shchita ba'ola lemitzvah. Okay, now, where do we learn shchita? Right, shchita in the ola is a mitzvah. Kabbalah nami lemitzvah eshkachan. Okay, so shchita has to be in the north for the ola. That we saw. It says shchata yeracham mizbeach tzafona. And Kabbalah we learned has to be in the north because then it goes to the next pasuk of and the kohen takes. So, right, 1 second. That was actually by the sin offering. So the Kabbalah, 1 second. The Kabbalah nami eshkachan aval mekabel b'tzafon. Right, this is what we just said. The mekabel has to be in the tzafon. Okay, that we got from this inference. So now, shchita v'kabbalah la'akev minalan. Where are we going to get shchita and kabbalah that it has to happen for the ola? That it's necessary, that without it it's disqualified. Amrava debrava v'itema rabba brashila kavachomer. We're going to have a kavachomer now. Uma chatat haba mikoch ola ma'akevet. Ola shaba chatat mikocha yeno din shma'akevet. This is a good kavachomer, right? If the chatat is learned out from the ola. Now the chatat we already showed, there were a number of times it was mentioned. So because of that, we learned it's ma'akev, right? We learned for the general chatat, because it's the sirah and the kispa, and we learned for the nasi also, because it says it in the other place. From there we see it's ma'akev. But for the ola, we don't. But if the chatat's learned for the ola, and the ola isn't ma'akev, and the chatat is, that doesn't make any sense. If the chatat, its power all comes from the ola, it's, just do it where that one was done. Then if that's ma'akev, obviously the original one must be essential. But they say, no, maybe it's more strict because it atones for current things. Amravina hakashale Rav Adabrava, klum matzinu tafel chamur min ha'ikar. They asked Rav Ada, and they said, there's no way, right? We don't ever see that something that's tafel is more strict than the ikar. Again, it's obvious that chatat is tafil because the Torah doesn't say where to do the chatat. It just says, do it where you do the ola. That means the ola is the main one and the more stringent one, and therefore we're going to obviously learn that from the other. Okay? And then we're going to question that theory. Is it really never true that the tafil is always is never chamor from the ikar? Is it always true? We're going to talk about that going forward. So what we did today was we started with the Mishna of the par and seir. We talked about the order. Why does that one come first? Specifically, the chata comes first and not the ola, which is strange, actually, especially where we ended. Right? It's obvious that the ola is the basis. And also why the chatat pnimit and not the chitzonah. So we said why those were considered more significant, either because it comes from a drasha or because the blood goes in the Kodesh Kodeshim. Then we got to where do we know by the ola that it has to be in the tzafon, and we saw that. And then we said the ben atzon, how do you know the ben bakar? And the vav mosif al yam rishon. From there we got on a big tangent. Is that really true according to everyone, right? Because the Gemara asked, what if you don't hold that way? How do we know we don't hold that way? Because of this machloket between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva. In the end we said that's not really the machloket between them. From there we moved to the chatat, and then how do we know the chatat's ma'akev? Right? How do you know it needs to phone the chatat, and then how do you know it's ma'akev? And we had the Nasi Pasuk and the Pasuk in chapter 6, and then we went back to the 2 Pasukim in chapter 4 about the regular sin offering, and we had all that. Then we said, so what's the oto? Why does it say slaughter it in the Nasi? And we had 4 possibilities, and the 5th one went back and reinstated the second possibility. Then in the end, it's oto b'tzafon, but not the shalchet b'tzafon. And then we talked about that, and then from there we got the shchita by ola as a mitzvah, and the Kabbalah is a mitzvah, but how do we know that, right, in the north, how do we know that they're both ma'akev? And then we said we learn it from a kal v'chomer from chatat, obviously. But then we said, is it obvious? Not obvious. We're kind of in the middle of that right now. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.